In 1835, a slave woman by the name of Joyce Heth was owned by one John S. Bowling and exhibited in Louisville, Kentucky. In June of that year, she was sold to promoters R.W. Lindsay and Coley Bartram, introducing her as the childhood nurse of George Washington. Lacking success in the endeavor, Lindsay sold her in her old age to aspiring entrepreneur and showman P.T. Barnum. Even though slavery was outlawed in New York, Barnum was able to purchase and keep Heth through a leasing loophole. Posters advertising her shows in 1835 claimed that she was the slave of Augustine Washington and the nurse of his son George Washington, and as a result of this was 161 years old, apparently. Towards the end of her life, Joyce was blind and almost completely paralyzed save for some limited speech and an ability to move her right arm, and was being worked by Barnum for 10 to 12 hours a day. Justifiably, there was significant doubt as to Barnum's claims about Joyce's age, and to dissuade the dissenters, Barnum announced that upon her death, she would be publicly autopsied. Joyce Heth died in New York the next year, no older than 79, and true to his word, Barnum did the live autopsy on her remains. When the surgeon declared the age claim was a fraud, Barnum made the defense that the autopsy victim was actually somebody else entirely, and that the real Joyce Heth was still on tour in Europe. It would not be for many years that Barnum would admit the hoax, and by that point his career in hoaxes, frauds, and showmanship was already firmly established. Barnum learnt from Heth that the exploitation of human beings could be used for profit, and thus began a lifelong career of dishonesty, human rights abuses, animal cruelty, and violence against marginalized groups for public entertainment. So, yeah, today we're talking about The Greatest Showman. Directed by Michael Gracie, yeah, I've never heard of him either, and starring Hugh Jackman as P.T. Barnum, The Greatest Showman tells the story of Barnum's rise to fame as he builds his circus of performers, human oddities, and acrobats, providing a home for the downtrodden and outcasts of society and giving his family the life that he so desperately wants to give them. Bright, hopeful, charming, and inspiring, mixing in memorable, catchy musical numbers and unforgettable dance sequences, The Greatest Showman is a movie musical for the ages. Except, no, it isn't. The Greatest Showman is actually a ponderous, idiotic, saccharine, sickeningly sweet mess masquerading as an inspiring tale of inclusivity. Okay, maybe that's being a bit too harsh, let's scale it back a little bit. If I'm being 100% honest, I have never been that big a fan of modern movie musicals. I've only liked 3 made in the last 20 years outside of Disney movies, these being La La Land, Chicago, and Sweeney Todd, so it wouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who knows me that I really did not like The Greatest Showman, purely from a genre perspective. I recognize movie musicals aren't really my forte, even though I do like a fair few of them. That being said, most of my problems with The Greatest Showman are with the movie as a whole. I hate it less because it's a movie musical and more because it's a bad movie just from a simple film analysis perspective. And before anyone types away at the comments saying, oh, you're not meant to analyze the movie, you're not meant to think about it, just shut up and enjoy it, just please just hear me out, okay? This movie really bothered me on a number of levels, and I've got a YouTube channel, so I've got the means to talk about this, so I'm going to do that. And that being said, here's a little brief history of P.T. Barnum, the real guy, before we go further into this video. Phineas Taylor Barnum was born in 1810 to innkeeper, tailor, and shopkeeper Philo Barnum. In 1835, after selling his store and moving from Connecticut to New York City, P.T. Barnum resolved to begin his career as a showman. He started this by purchasing that little slave woman that we had previously mentioned a few minutes ago. After a few years of mixed successes, Barnum purchased Schuder's American Museum and converted it into his own showplace. His museum featured live performances, acts, animals, and human oddities. He also showcased many hoaxes at the museum, such as a fake mermaid created by taking the head of a monkey and sticking it to the tail of a fish. Another early attraction he got for his show was the famous dwarf General Tom Thumb, infinitely older in the movie version. When Barnum finds Tom Thumb in the movie, he's in his 20s, when in reality he was only 5 years old when he was taken away from his home. Tom Thumb would impersonate Cupid, Napoleon, along with many other caricatures, and he would often drink and smoke on stage for public amusement, all before he was 10 years of age. Another one one of Barnum's exploits was to charter a ship to capture elephants from Sri Lanka. He took 9 elephants, including 1 calf, away from their homes and families and kept them confined to cramped compartments without any fresh air for 4 months. Barnum also acquired 2 beluga whales and imprisoned them in a tank in the basement of his New York museum. Both of these whales were dead within 2 days. Barnum also introduced the bull hook as a method of controlling the animals in his circus. Consisting of a heavy baton with a sharp steel hook on the end, this weapon was used by Barnum and other circus proprietors constantly and is still being used in some circuses today. Barnum would go on to be remembered as the founder of the American circus, the Shakespeare of advertising, and famously coined the phrase, "There is a sucker born every minute." But while history has looked on P.T. Barnum in a more favourable light, evidenced by this recent portrayal of him, the reality of what he did was less than savoury. He repeatedly took advantage of everyone who worked for him, launched what would go on to be a century and a half of animal cruelty, and basically exploited every single human and animal he could make a buck off of. So when you hear someone complaining that The Greatest Showman revised a bit of history when it came to Barnum's life, just remember that that is really quite an understatement. There is not a single mention of Barnum's exploitation of slaves, Native Americans, the disabled, and as a result of concerns from PETA, any inclusion of animal cruelty was removed from the film if it was ever even there to begin with. While I'm no fan of watching innocent people from marginalized groups getting exploited or animals being hurt in movies, romanticizing a man who actively took advantage of and abused both people and animals does just seem a little bit wrong. There are a lot of problems with The Greatest Showman's portrayal of one of America's greatest monsters, but my interests are more comprehensive. And they start with... The Greatest Showman is a musical about a selfish, entitled asshole attempting to make money off of the talents and biological oddities of the people who work for him. The movie simultaneously romanticizes P.T. Barnum and makes him a fundamentally unlikable character, but for all of the wrong reasons. Barnum begins his career in show business in the movie by outright stealing money from a bank, taking out a large loan after deceiving them into accepting his former employer's sunken ships as collateral. And the movie frames this as being something of a noble act by a lovable, fun-loving entrepreneur. Barnum repeatedly embarrasses and distances himself from his wife and children throughout the movie, despite claiming that they are the reasons that he's doing all that he's doing. He outright abandons both his business partner and the freaks in his circus for the sake of touring an opera singer around America, and is generally a selfish, terrible person to everyone he meets. Now, the fact that Barnum was an asshole in the movie wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing were it not for 2 very important facts. One, as previously stated, Barnum in real life was an asshole for very, very different reasons than the movie made him out to be. And 2, he does not suffer a single lasting consequence for the entire movie for him being an asshole. I wouldn't necessarily be complaining about the historical inaccuracies in the movie were it not for the fact that the movie seems perfectly aware, at least to some degree, that Barnum was an indisputable monster in reality. Yet despite this awareness, the film is remarkably coy about the terrible things that the man did, and instead dresses him up as being an asshole for different, more relatable and less anger-inducing reasons. Yeah, he may have been a bit of a prick to his wife and children, but come on guys, it's not like he purchased an old black, paralyzed and blind slave woman and worked her for 10 to 12 hours a day until she died and then did a live autopsy on her body. It's not like he was that bad or anything. The main problem is that the movie frames what he did and his exploitative nature of the people around him as being a negative, but ultimately it doesn't really go anywhere with it. Barnum commits bank fraud, abandons everyone who trusts him, including his wife and children, basically acts like a cocky, self-important asshole to everyone around him, and ultimately suffers no consequences for it. His museum is burnt down? Doesn't matter, Zac Efron has some money saved away, so they just buy a spot of land and get a tent. His wife rightly leaves him because he was an absentee dick who neglected her and their kids. It's okay, they sing a song and all is forgiven. This film really sums up everything that I hate about modern musicals, just in its story and its sense of morality. Characters do awful things, but don't suffer a single consequence for them, or the consequences that they do suffer have no lasting impacts. This sort of romanticized story is much better explored and deconstructed in La La Land. In La La Land, you are meant to relate to the main characters, sure, but it makes no pretense about their goals being unrealistic or their actions being detrimental to one another. It more successfully exposes the reality of their dreams and desires and shows that their actions do indeed have actual consequences. In The Greatest Showman, the consequences suffered by the main character aren't even suffered by him. He repeatedly takes advantage of his entourage of freaks and his family, but barely suffers at all for it. The freaks are suffering, they lose their home after it gets burnt down in the midst of a brawl with an angry mob, but no, the movie has to take time to show Barnum is the real depressed one. The movie shows him drinking at a bar and goes, "Aw, isn't it sad that the guy's circus burnt down? Don't you just feel so bad for him after he abandons his wife and his supposed friends and is exposed by the bank as a fraud?" I mean, forget about the freaks who have just been left homeless and everything thanks to their only real source of income getting burnt down in a giant fire. Barnum is the one that you should really be feeling sorry for. You know, any movie that attempts to portray P.T. Barnum's life story on screen, that tries to make him out as being the sympathetic one instead of the people that he, you know, took advantage of and exploited in his lifetime, any movie that tries to do that is going to run into a couple of problems. First of which is, it would be missing out on some pretty big historical facts there. And the second problem would be, you would be really ultimately ignoring the plight of the people who were really much more deserving of sympathy than the guy who exploited them. The Greatest Showman has 3 stories going on in it that barely intersect and have very little to do with each other once you've given them more than a passing thought. The story of the tragic, ostracized freaks of Barnum's circus, Barnum trying to find success on the stage, and the love story of Zac Efron and Zendaya. And these 3 stories really have nothing to do with each other outside of the fact that these people know each other. The themes of the movie can really be summarized as being about inclusivity, specifically the inclusivity of people who may have been otherwise ostracized from society because of physical attributes outside of their control. This Is Me, sung in the movie by the freaks of the circus as a giant fuck you to the crowd of people spewing abuse at them, highlights this theme most prominently. However, the problem isn't this particular theme itself, but more how the movie goes about portraying it, specifically what it chooses to focus on. You would think that a story about accepting the odd and physically unusual whilst not outcasting them from society would actually focus on the freaks themselves, but no, the film feels the need to spread its focus out among 3 separate storylines, cluttering up the pace and generally putting those who should be center stage to the background to make way for the other characters. The plot thread that has the most connection with the freak story is the romance between Efron and Zendaya. But while Efron feels bad for the freaks, I guess his story is more about him wanting to sleep with a black girl and being outcast from his wealthy family because of it. And while it's all well and good trying to have that kind of thing in a movie about inclusivity, it ultimately works to the detriment of the movie's message. For one, the character who is given the most focus in this particular subplot of the movie is the white guy who comes from a wealthy background and not the black girl who is, you know, still considered subhuman by many Americans at the point in history that this movie is set. In fact, that consideration also holds pretty true for this period of history as well, now that I think about it. Yeah, I know you've been mistreated and most likely abused for most of your life just because of the color of your skin, but my parents are being real dicks to me too because I want to bone you. I think I deserve some sympathy here too, you know? See, here's the thing. If you're going to include a message about race relations in a movie about inclusivity, which don't get me wrong, I'm all for that idea, but you're not actually going to focus on the characters of color who are being legitimately discriminated against and marginalized, then we're going to run into a few problems. The plot revolving around P.T. Barnum is among the more infuriating in the movie. After meeting the opera singer Jenny Lind, both Barnum and the entire film seem to completely forget about the freaks in the circus, and instead goes on with this whole tangent about Barnum becoming enamored with the fame and fortune that Lind's performances are getting him. And the big thing to note here that the movie oddly doesn't so much as mention is that none of the main characters really care about the freaks. Barnum certainly doesn't give a shit, he's only interested in making fame and fortune and providing for his family. His wife at no point shows any kind of care or consideration for the freaks of the circus. Efron's character only really gives a shit about them because one of them is a girl that he wants to bang, a girl that just so happens to be the best looking freak in the whole show. Funny that. See, this is what I mean when I say that this movie lacks any real sort of thematic focus. It doesn't know if it wants to focus on the freaks trying to be proud of themselves and proud of their differences, or if it wants to focus on P.T. Barnum being an asshole and distancing himself from his family. So when you've got theme 1 over here and theme 2 over here, these two things don't often mesh with each other, and that's where the film can run into a few problems. This isn't helped by the lack of characterization on everyone's part. Barnum's wife is one of the most useless and underdeveloped characters in the whole movie, and literally exists to be nothing but the trophy wife. Zendaya's character is flat and ultimately does nothing. Most of the freaks are relegated to the background, and only 2 of them are given any kind of defining character traits outside of their oddities. The characters of The Greatest Showman don't exist as characters in their own rights, they exist to be props to hammer a message in, a message which isn't supported at all by the narrative that it's telling. The theme of inclusivity rings pretty hollow when the characters who have been excluded from society aren't the ones that your movie focuses on. So The Greatest Showman, a story supposedly about freakish people finding pride in their freakishness, focuses mainly on the overwhelmingly white, non-freakish characters of the narrative, and barely gives any of the oppressed characters that the film claims to be championing any due credit or screen time. And if your movie is going to spend half of its time criticizing and dressing down the nature of the oppressive and restrictive society that they inhabit, whilst at the same time hypocritically endorsing it, then we may have to have words. I'm not going to be a complete cold-hearted monster and say that there is no value in this movie, because I recognize what it's intending to do. It's not endeavoring to be true to life or overly realistic. It's not trying to tell the true story of P.T. Barnum. More than anything else, The Greatest Showman is endeavoring to be a hopeful tale about overcoming oppression, bigotry, and an exclusive society by taking pride in the things that you are being excluded for. It's not trying to be realistic, it's trying to be hopeful, which I'm sure it is for many, many people out there. Hence why the This Is Me song is likely so uplifting to people both young and old who may feel ostracized and disconnected because of traits that they don't have any control over. However, the freaks in the movie are the ones who are doing the actual hard work. They are the ones suffering oppression, they are the ones having to endure the hardships of bigotry, while the characters that the movie focuses on, such as P.T. Barnum, his wife, Zac Efron's character, and so on, are not having to go through any such thing. And this is a fact that gets conveniently ignored once the movie decides that love and family are the most important things. Love conquers all, family matters most, all of that stuff. But by putting so much emphasis on this, the movie undermines its message and the actual plight of the freaks that it's claiming to endorse. They don't exist as characters in their own right, they exist to be props, inspirational cannon fodder for the audience to lap up and consume without putting any thought into it. The reason The Greatest Showman is so insulting is not its annoying pop songs or how poorly said pop songs are paced in the movie, it is insulting because it treats its audience like children and the people that it's claiming to represent like cardboard devices. It panders to audience expectations and offers nothing substantial in its messaging. Because the reality of P.T. Barnum's story was not one of offering hope to the marginalized of the world and becoming distracted by wealth and fame. It was not some romantic tale of one showman trying to make a life for his family. It was one of abuse, exploitation, and violence and cruelty against anyone that Barnum could profit off of. And that's the main problem with the film. It and its fictionalized narrative have overshadowed and sanitized a painful, terrible, and uncomfortable period of Western history which we are still feeling the effects of today. There is nothing noble or admirable about romanticizing a man who was guilty of such horrendous crimes, especially if all you're going to do is add insult to injury by not giving those that he took advantage of their due credit. That's the fatal flaw in The Greatest Showman. It is sympathetic to marginalized underclasses that were violently taken advantage of by an oppressive society, but ultimately the film ends up being the very embodiment of the voice of those who oppressed them. That's why a story about the downtrodden and freaks of society ends up actually being about this guy.